Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah thumma ma ba'd. In this reflection, we want to speak about the problematic nature of a Muslim not having a grasp of Islamic sciences. What we find is that when the Muslim does not afford himself or herself of the tools by which to understand the Quran and the Sunnah, tools which were given to us from early on, tools which originated in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. These tools are the tools of comprehending the deen. We see that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam early on in his mission and in his career educated his companions in that which was necessary to understand and apply the Quran and the Sunnah. The companions themselves had a grasp of the Arabic language. So there was not much necessity on their part to study the Arabic language in an academic sense. We see this does occur later on in Islamic history, in particular when the Muslims migrate to Iraq. The children of the Muslims begin to fall short of mastering in practice the principles of the Arabic language. So we see that Abu Aswad al-Du'ali, rahmatullahi alayhi, and Imam Ali, karamallahu wajh, begin to discuss this problem, the necessity of educating the youth in the Arabic language because of their failure to properly work with its principles and communicate with it effectively and efficiently. But early on, the Arabic language was no problem to the companions, and we find that the companions themselves had a mastery of the language, but their focus was on understanding not the Arabic language per se, but the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran was being descended before their very eyes, and day after day, depending upon what period they lived in, they would see the Quran manifest itself in different ways, and sometimes they would see that revelation would come to a pause and then resume. In any event, whether they saw revelation unfold with frequency or they saw a break in revelation, they witnessed the reality of the descent of the whole of the Quran. So then they understood the context in which the Quran was revealed. They understood what we call in the Arabic language as bab and nuzul. They understood the relationship between ayat of the Quran to the chapter that the ayat of the Quran or the verses of the Quran. They understood the way those ayat interrelated to one another and interrelated with the chapter and interrelated to other chapters, one chapter to the other. And this is what we call ilm al-munasabat. And so the knowledge of the relationship of the Quran to itself is something that was very clear to them in how to understand the implementation. And if there was an issue that was not clear, they had ulama among themselves that had learned this reality directly from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so they had the ability to explain. There was no problem with the Sunnah during the time of the companions early on, because the companions had no necessity to necessarily determine what hadith is sound from what hadith is false. Yeah, we see that there were principles in place that were used by some of the major companions like Ali, like Abu Bakr, like Aisha, in determining a hadith to be from the Prophet Muhammad or not to be from the Prophet Muhammad. But we find that the fabrication of hadith was non-existent. We find that the companions actually searched out the knowledge of hadith, so that, or the knowledge of the Sunnah, better said, so that it could be used in interpreting the Quran. But they lived with the Prophet Muhammad directly, so they imbibed they took on from him principles which were necessary to understand the book and the Sunnah. And because they understood the Arabic language, because they saw the descent of the Quran, because they saw the way that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam interpreted the Quran, they understood what are the proper methodologies that are acceptable in interpreting the Quran. And we find that at times the companions differed with one another in the way they interpreted things, and this is what we consider to be the source of the different methodologies which we find in Usul al-Fiqh, one of the principles of fiqh, that the companions had their methodologies that they gathered and learned from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ultimately, these different methodologies, which we consider to be plural, are overall one methodology, because they all come from the spring of nur or light, and that is the Prophet Muhammad himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from his teachings, in other words. So we run into a problem here, and that problem is that many of the Muslims in the contemporary period think that it is possible to directly go to the Quran and the Sunnah without a grasp of the Arabic language and without a grasp of understanding the context in which the Quran was revealed, or the way that the Quran relates to itself internally, the way the ayat of the Quran relate one to another, or the way that surah of the Quran or chapters of the Quran relate to one another. This lack of understanding of the way the Arabic language is used, or the way that the Quran has an internal structure that composes an internal unity, and this lack of understanding the methodology of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in applying the Quran to reality, and understanding that the Quran has objectives and goals, and understanding how the Quran relates to people's lives and how the Quran relates to context. This in itself has led to a great misunderstanding among the Muslims. A misunderstanding in interpretation and in application. There's no way that the Muslim can approach the Quran or the Sunnah without Usul al-Fiqh. Usul al-Fiqh, the science of how do we work with the Arabic language as it manifests itself in the Quran and the Sunnah. The science that teaches us how to deal with contradictions as they may appear to us. The science which teaches us how to deal with hadith. The science which teaches us how to deal with Quran and how the Quran and hadith relate to one another. The science which teaches us what we need to know in order to be able to approach the Quran and the Sunnah. The foundations of this science were there in the time of the Prophet Muhammad himself. So to deviate from a study of Usul al-Fiqh, we don't have to agree with everything that's in Usul al-Fiqh as a science as it manifests itself in later daytimes. But there is no possibility of the Muslim to be able to come to an understanding of the Quran or the Sunnah without Usul al-Fiqh. Period. Point blank. This is proven when the person does a study of the history of Usul al-Fiqh itself and history of fiqh itself, to see that these very principles of interpretation were taught by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to the companions. The Prophet engaged the companions in such a way that he gave them opportunities to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah, and then monitored their methodology and verified what they used as a way to achieve an understanding or cancel that understanding out. As a matter of fact, the very act of interpretation, when it was performed properly and when the Prophet verified it, became part of the Sunnah. When we look at the fact that the Ummah overall, even Imam Ibn Hazm, the Imam who carried the school of Dawood al-Zahiri, rahmatullahi alayhi, Imam Dawood al-Zahiri, had his own school which is considered today to be the literalist school, he took the meanings of the Quran and the Sunnah at face value. Imam Ibn Hazm, rahmatullahi alayh, was the predecessor of what we call today a literal interpretation. He was the inheritor of the school of Dawud al-Zahiri, and he was its main exponent that we know today. We have his works, rahmatullahi alayh. Even this great Imam in his approach has a work in Usul al-Fiqh according to his methodology. There's no way that we can come to an understanding of the book and the Sunnah without Usul al-Fiqh. And this is what leads to interpretations which are extreme and misguided. The lack of understanding Usul al-Fiqh. The lack of going to the scholarly tradition and seeing how the scholars derive from the book and the Sunnah rulings which they can apply. The misunderstanding of this science is detrimental to this ummah, because we find people think that they can interpret the Quran and the Sunnah without relying upon scholarly principles. And there's no way that we cannot label this effort of interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah without scholarly principles as none other than following desire. And this is what the ulama of old called ittiba al-hawa, ittiba al-hawa, ahlul hawa, following of desire and the people of desire. This is what characterizes interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. As a matter of fact, interpreting translations of the Quran and the Sunnah without scholarly principle, without even relying upon the understanding of those who came before us in ilm and in deen. This is a big problem and detriment in our community, that each person thinks they can understand and interpret the Quran and the Sunnah without relying on those who have laid the path of understanding before us. And we're not just talking about the companions and the tabi'un and the tabi'un radiallahu anhum ajma'in, but we're also talking about the ulama who came after. Is it possible to rely upon Bukhari, rahmatullahi alayh, that Imam who stands on his own with his own madhab, Imam al-Bukhari, Amir al-Mu'mineen fil Hadith? Is it possible to rely upon him without having come to Bukhari by way of the scholars who preserved Bukhari afterwards? Ulama who sacrificed their lives and their time and their effort to pen Bukhari with their own hands to ensure that we have copies of Bukhari in this age, or those who even took Bukhari to the printing press in an effort to preserve Bukhari for later generations. In other words, the knowledge of Islam depends on the efforts of those who come before us. And the knowledge of Islam in this age will depend upon the efforts of those who live in this age and pass the knowledge of Islam on properly to the next generation. So we as Muslims have to pay attention to the science which we call Usul al-Fiqh, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. There is no possibility of understanding this deen properly if we don't first sit at the seat of the scholars of Usul. Once we come to a sound, in-depth knowledge, then we're able to understand the debates that take place within the discourse of Usul al-Fiqh, and we're able to judge in favor of this principle over that principle, or this application over that application. But before so, the Muslims are obligated to study, and the Muslims are obligated to become verified in Usul al-Fiqh to be able to reach that level where they're able to discuss the differences of opinion amongst the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh. But interpretations which come into this deen without relying on Usul al-Fiqh, without qualifying to be people of interpretation, to be people that can derive from the Quran and the Sunnah, these are interpretations which are rejected. We talk about proof, then we need system. And that system that we need is the system which regulates proofs, which we call detailed proofs. We need those general principles, which we call general proofs of interpretation and proofs of reconciliation of contradictions, proofs which help us to understand the Arabic language. Any in-depth study will show the reality of this argument to be sound, and there's no one in the ummah of standing in ilm which will reject usul al-fiqh. Some may reject certain practices in usul al-fiqh or certain trends in usul al-fiqh, but no one, not Imam ibn Taymiyah, not Imam Shaukani, not Imam Shah Wali Ullah none of the Imams that came in the later period calling to ijtihad denied the role of usul al-fiqh. None of the Imams in the earlier period that called to ijtihad and called to the practice of the Sunnah denied usul al-fiqh. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal rahmatullahi alayh indicated to us that we are in need of Imam Shafi'i, of the knowledge that he has. That knowledge that he was speaking about is the knowledge of Usul al-Fiqh. And when we look at the history of Usul al-Fiqh and we see the role that Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi, Nasr al-Sunnah, the supporter and aid of the Sunnah, played in communicating the knowledge of Usul al-Fiqh, then there we will find that Imam Ahmad, the Imam in Hadith, he said that we need this knowledge, the knowledge of Usul al-Fiqh. So there's no interpreting the deen without those principles. So many fatwa that come, or many positions that are put out there without having a grasp of the knowledge of Usul al-Fiqh are actually positions which cause a danger to Islam, because they are positions which are based on desire and not positions which are based on knowledge. And this is something that I think that no scholar in today's time will disagree with, except that he be going against the majority position of the scholars. So be advised, student of knowledge, that there's no path to ilm and interpretation except by way of usul al-fiqh. And those who try to traverse this long journey of understanding the Quran and the Sunnah without usul al-fiqh are those who are going against the minhaj or methodology of those who came before us. There's no alim, there's no scholar, there's no mujtahid of standing in this deen, whether he tended to be athari in his approach or whether he tended to be a person of the maqasid of the sharia, or whether he was a person that combined the methodologies, whether he was within the madhab, or whether he weighed the opinions between the madhab, or whether he came up with his own madhab. There's no scholar of these types which did not rely upon usul al-fiqh. And I advise you to prove this argument wrong or to prove it sound, to go to the history of usul al-fiqh to understand the standing of this science among the scholars of Islam, to understand the proof and the truth of what is being said. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.